Okay, so we have spent the first part of the lecture talking about how the question of self, the existence of self, has been denied and affirmed through the history of Western philosophy. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle affirms it. At the same time, we have the atomists, Democritus and Lysippus, denying it. During the Hellenistic period, we had talked about the Plotinus and other Platonic tradition philosophers affirming it, and at the same time we had Epicurus, who are also atomists, follow the path of Epicurus and Democritus, the path of Democritus and Lysippus denying it. Then during the Middle Ages, whether it is the Judaic, Islamic or Christian scholastic thinkers, they generally speaking all affirmed the existence of self as an immortal self-subsisting substance, which is the human soul that exists even after death. Then in modern ages, Descartes affirms it, and other rationalists for the most part, but the mechanistic empiricists like Hobbes and Hume and many others that followed their path denied it. With the German idealists, the question of self, even though a question of absolute self, became central to philosophy, and then this impacts philosophical influenced the thought in both what is later called French and English idealism, and even American idealism, where the self, or consciousness or the ego was affirmed. Then in phenomenology and then existentialism, these continue as subjectivity, and the question of subjectivity in both phenomenology and existentialism, and then later in personalism. So what we need to do now is, what is this self? What is this self? So as a way of helping us to understand what we are talking about when we say self, it looks abstract, but it's not very that abstract. It's simple. From conception, from when the male reproductive cell meets with the female reproductive cell, the ovum and the sperm meets, conception takes place. From that point, a reality is formed, and this reality keeps developing baby zygote until birth. And after birth, this baby, from trying to crawl to speaking to walking, now went to elementary school. From elementary school, he goes to junior school. From junior school, he goes to high school, or from primary school, he goes to secondary school, depending on how the term used in the educational system. And then he goes to college or university, and then he graduates. And then he gets work, he marries, have kids, establish a family, grow to old age, and then dies. The question is, physically, they have been changed. There's this morphological change. However, there's this permanent reality that continues from conception until through the lifespan of this human person. That permanent reality, that permanent, all this I'm talking about, this description is what we call the problem of personal identity in philosophy. So that permanent reality of the person that remains the same. And that's why you today in university, you see a picture of you and your classmates in elementary school, you say, this is me. Even though you are now grown, taller, bigger, but you say, this is me. So the same you that is now in university is the same you in the elementary school. Even though you are physically different, but there is that permanent reality that is the same you now in university and the elementary school. This is what we call the self. This is what is being denied or affirmed through the history of Western philosophy, as we just exposed. So for the religious, that even after death, post-death, that this self continues. So it's only with revelation that one can have a comprehensive understanding of that. But philosophically, there could be some kind of philosophical demonstration of the possibility of it, but that after death, that this self continues to exist, it is more a theological question. So now, because of this, the selfhood is a problem in natural science. It's simple. The natural science will mean basically the biology, chemistry, and physics. The physical science. So it is a problem because if you take me and you split me, you dissect me, there's no one particular part you will say this is where the self is. The self is not a chemical substance. The self is not a physical substance. The self is not the brain. So what is the self? So it is a problem in natural science to establish the existence of self by the research methodology of natural science. It is difficult. There's some kind of thing going on with neuroscience that deals with the investigation of the brain and the neurons. But how much can we go through neuroscience to establishing the self? It's a different question. I recommend the work of John Eckers, The Brain and Itself, co-authored with Karl Popper, and some other of John Eckers' work, which I've already, you can read some of my papers on that, and the article which will be referenced in this lecture. We have tried to look at that. So today, this self, even with the era of artificial intelligence, the question of the self is even more challenged, which when you read my article, you're going to be clear about that. So in natural science, the selfhood is a problem, and it will remain a problem, because we're talking about a reality that is not within the epistemic, realm of the natural science, because it is not a physical substance. If it exists, it is not a body. So it is a problem. However, the selfhood of human person, as revealed in moral consciousness, is not a problem. So we are going to using John Crosby. John Crosby is somebody I recommend, the philosopher I recommend, who has done a very beautiful work on the selfhood of the human person. And he will argue, and which everyone can agree, the experience of the moral experience, the experience of duty, moral responsibility. A very good example here, we are in examples I usually use in the class here in Taiwan. In the Chinese culture, philosophical thinking, the notion of what they call Xiao Ti, if you like, English loosely translated as filial piety, a reverence of a child to its parents, to his or her parents. So for the worst experience of a Taiwanese or a Chinese cultural person is that when most times see parents say, "Oh, my child is not when this pushao xuan in Chinese, it means is not reverencing me. Is not obedient. Is not submissive. Is not respectful to me as his or her parents." So this experience is real for for the Chinese child or the Taiwanese child or the Chinese cultural person who's having this conflict with his parents, and it's a reality that the child knows that I should be this kind of person. I should be a child that has filial piety. But if I don't, it's a re-experience. And where does the child experience this? Is it just in the brain or in the body? No. There is in himself. There's something that the culture has built in himself that is bringing that moral conflict within him or her. So during the moral struggle, we experience the self. And that is the point. So in moral consciousness, the existence of the self cannot be easily be denied. So Crosby, I recommend his work. Persons are ends in themselves and never mere instrumental means. Persons are wholes of their own and never mere parts. We from this selfhood, we'll look at now the selfhood of the person. And to understand the selfhood of the person, we need to understand the person. And then there are 4 principles of persons that Crosby has articulated in his work. He's articulated the first one, very much Kantian. Person are end in themselves and never mere instrumental means. In other words, a person should never be used merely as an instrument, because every person is an end in itself. That's the first principle of personhood. Because of the selfhood of the person. The second one, persons are whole of their own and never mere parts. So a person is a whole. Every person is a whole, not just a part. The third one, persons are incommunicably their own and never mere specimens. The fourth one, in the Latin verse, persona est sui juris et non ulterius. Each person belongs to himself and not to any other. In other words, the first point, persons are incommunicably their own. I cannot exchange my selfhood with another person. A set of identical twins, they may completely look alike physically, but they have completely different selfhood. No 2 persons have the same self. So what you and me, everyone in the class have in common, every human being have in common, is that we are all persons. We are going to look at the definition of persons later. However, we all are persons, but we all are not the same self. We don't have the same selfhood. And no one can exchange itself with another. It is not possible. That persons are incommunicable. That is the point. I cannot transfer myself to you. Myself totally belongs to me. That is the point here. Each person belongs to his or herself and never to another. I cannot exchange myself with another person. Self. Because these 4 principles of persons, if there's nothing else one takes home from this lecture, is these 4 principles of persons. I always emphasize it. The person as a subject of right here is a kind of indirect confirmation, Crosby says, that rights of the person derive precisely from the belongings of persons to themselves. So why we talk about individual rights? We talk about individual rights because every person has a self that can never be transferred to another, that is incommunicable and that completely belongs to itself. And therefore, when we deal with persons, we should deal with persons because they have self, and therefore, they are not mere instruments. I am talking with a microphone. After this lecture, I will keep this microphone and go. The microphone does not have a self. Therefore, it doesn't have an intrinsic value. It's merely an instrument. But a human being is not merely an instrument, because a human being has self. So that is the point. So it is different with the worth or dignity of the person. I can respect or violate my own dignity no less than that of another. But my rights are essentially more social, needing another person to respect or violate them. So Crosby here is trying to make a distinction between the dignity of a person and the right of a person. Okay? Dignity of a person and respect, right of a person is more social. Okay? I have a right to be respected. Okay? So he's saying that the dignity of a person can violate his own dignity. Some person can live their life without dignity. Okay? But a person needs another to respect his rights as a self, as a person. So this is the point I'm trying to make here.